Chapter 37. The Last Chapter. Tuji struggled with himself, trying his absolute hardest to wrest back control of his body as it drew closer and closer to the Ilum tree that loomed over him. Every step he took was completely out of his power, as was every breath or twitch of the fingers. It seemed that his body was lost to him. Tuji had never felt this way in his life. This utter lack of control, this helplessness, it was a repulsive feeling. No matter how hard he fought, his body refused to obey his commands. His memories of what led him to this fate were hazy. The only thing that Tuji could remember was that he had been defeated by Hoplite. Why was Tuji not dead? He had been dead, or at least close to it. But why would Hoplite not ensure Tuji's demise with a blast from one of his thunderstaves? Perhaps Tuji really was dead, and instead of dining in Zod's hall for eternity, he was damned to prowl the pits of Anchorus. If that truly were the case, though, then why did the pits look like the Fae would? No, Tuji was not dead. Though if he could not retake control of his actions, he'd soon wish he were. Tuji's head then shot up of its own accord, eyes staring intently at the towering Ilum tree. That black pillar of wood almost completely blotted out the sun's rays, its many branches spreading out like fissures in the blue sky. His mouth forcefully quirked up into a smirk, and in an instant, Tuji was somewhere else. His surroundings had changed from a field of midnight black soil to a circular chamber of gnarled wood. A massive glowing yellow crystal hung suspended from dozens of roots overhead, bathing the whole room in a shade of radiant gold. Where was this? How had he come to be here? Was he having some sort of strange nightmare? Several elves sat high above the chamber he stood in, seated in high-backed wooden thrones. These thrones were seemingly grown straight out of the ground, and somehow seemed ornate despite their knobby appearance. The seated elves all looked down at Tuji with wide eyes, and you could easily read the surprise in their gazes. Tuji would have furrowed his brow at that, had he control of his body. His Dulka was underdeveloped and weak compared to that of a full-blooded elf, and he'd rarely ever been able to read the emotions of another person. So why was it so easy now? What had changed since his defeat at Hoplite's hands?
"Hark, mother,"
Tuji said, his mouth working of its own will.
"Your rule has been weak and fraught with ill-made decisions."
Tuji continued, his finger pointing directly at a matriarchal elf woman above. So this was the Hark Mother? If that was the case, then this was most definitely the Hark Hall. But why was he here? Why was Tuji saying these things? Her green eyes regarded Tuji as she fingered a strand of her long blonde hair. Fear was in her eyes, though she did a good job at concealing it outwardly. A very composed woman to resist fleeing from the ice-cold terror she felt. Perhaps she recognized Tuji somehow. If she did, it could only be because he'd been described to her by the Watchers. After all, Tuji had never met this woman in his life. Tuji's finger lowered finally, and again his lips quirked up in a smirk.
"It is time that the Hark Hall be disbanded. Dre never set up this system of governing. It was a purely mortal decision. Therefore, I break none of his laws in overthrowing you to install a more efficient form of rule."
The Hark Mother drew her lips to a tight line, glaring down at Tuji with fire in her eyes. All the previous fear evaporating from the sheer heat of her rage. It was hard to believe that he had ever respected the woman. She was a fool and a coddler. Tuji would have blinked in shock had he been capable of it. Respected this woman? Tuji had never even met her. Where had that stream of thought come from? It was alien and most certainly not his own.
"You will be gone from this place, creature. Our Lord Dre will smite you from our sight." "Mother," Tuji said, cutting her off, "Dre is not going to stop me. I wouldn't have even been able to get this far had he not wanted me to. Do you not see? This is Dre's will," he shouted, flinging his arms wide. "Look me in the eyes, Mother, and know me for who I really am."
A second passed, then another, as the Harkmother peered into his eyes. The woman blinked before gasping in horror, placing a hand to her chest as her jaw hung agape. "Turlin!" the Harkmother shouted. "How can this be?" Turlin grinned as he shoved Tuji to the recesses of his mind, locking the foolish orc away as he crossed his arms. It seemed that the creature's soul had not been completely purged as Turlin had hoped. Another discovery to be marked down in his notes once his business here was concluded. This was a kind of magic that no one had attempted to use across all of preserved history. At least, not in the history that common people were privy to. Turlin crossed his broad arms over his chest as he glared up at the Harkmother, his fiery eyes boring holes into her skull. If the Harkmother didn't comply with his commands, then Turlin may have to do just that.
"I had to do what was necessary," Turlin explained. "With the body of this Pillarborn, I will overthrow all of you," Turlin told him, his eyes finding each member of the Harkhall. "Now bow if you value your lives. I, Turlin Fireeyes, declare myself as king of the Bastion."
"Slay him!" the Harkmother shouted at Magulin, another sitter for the hall. Magulin was a small elven man with a dangerous dukkha, being capable of slicing flesh with only his eyes. Magulin had slain countless Akandari during the Expansion War, and alongside Turlin had served as the Harkhall's enforcer, should a situation as this play out. Of course, none of the members of the Harkhall would have ever anticipated a Pillarborn coming to attack them. Turlin wanted to shock the Hall into submission, not slaughter them. They were not all fools like the Harkmother, but they were certain to go against his rightful rule. There would only need to be one example made, hopefully, and that example would have to be Magulin. Unfortunate, but Turlin's old friend would need to be slain, for he knew that Magulin would not back down from his duty. Magulin was one of the reasons why Turlin had opted to take possession of Tuji's body. Magulin's dukkha alone had been the only real threat to Turlin's plans. At least before he had obtained this new body, of course. Magulin had always been just slightly faster in activating his dukkha than Turlin had, meaning that in most scenarios, Magulin would kill Turlin before he had the chance to set him aflame. With the Pillarborn's steel flesh, however, it could be resisted. Indeed, Turlin felt an invisible force strike his throat, and as Turlin had hoped, it merely glanced off his skin, a clang echoing through the chamber. He stared at Magulin, the elf showing terror in his eyes, just before Turlin used his own dukkha in retaliation. In an instant, Magulin erupted in flame, and he tumbled out of his chair screaming, falling headfirst into the visitor's platform and cracking his skull open on the gnarled floor. Turlin ceased the flame in that instant, approaching the burnt body and looming over it. Surprisingly, Magulin coughed, raising a hand toward Turlin with horrified eyes. Mercy, Magulin wheezed through burnt lips, his gray eyes desperate.
"I am sorry, friend. It has to be this way,"
Turlin said coldly, before he stomped on Magulin's skull, the heel sinking into the forehead with a sickening crunch of bone. Turlin sighed as he heard Tuji wailing in the back of his mind.
"You violate Toma!"
the creature shouted from the murky depths of his subconsciousness.
"Stop this!"
He huffed in irritation at the mewling voice of the body's former owner. Turlin had thought that this possession would have purged the Pillarborn's consciousness completely, yet somehow it seemed that the monster's soul still held on. Perhaps it was something to do with the divine blood the orc had been born with. Turlin silenced the wretched voice again as he easily leaped to the high seats above, coming to loom over the Harkmother's throne. She flinched away, sinking back into her throne before averting her fearful gaze.
"So, what will it be, Mother?"
Turlin asked, readying his fist to deliver a killing blow to her skull. Hector leaned back at his throne with a heavy sigh, a low guttural sound that echoed throughout the empty stone chamber. There was really no need for Hector to bother with guards. None would be able to protect him better than Hector himself could. It was far less risky as well. A hired guard could easily be a spy from an enemy blocklord, or an assassin paid by the gangs of the Akandari to eliminate him. There have been assassins, of course. Several had come to try and slay Hector over this past decade, and all had failed. Most were dealt with by his capable servants, true. But the ones that did make it to Hector never stood a chance. His senses were just far too keen to allow any would-be killer to sneak up on him. Those very senses allowed Hector to hear the footsteps echoing outside his empty throne room, and he froze an instant before easing back into his seat. The weight of the footsteps and the distance between them indicated that it was his most trusted servant, Glenn. Hector was soon proven correct, as Glenn's signature knock soon echoed from the far end of the chamber, and he grinned. Hector then sat up on his throne, quickly combing a knot from his black beard before he bellowed, "Enter, Glenn." The ornately carved wooden door then slowly swung open, two other men heaving on the door to allow Glenn to enter the throne room. After he passed over the threshold, Glenn urged the two men to shut the doors once more. They immediately went to work, pulling the doors closed and leaving Glenn and Hector alone in the wide chamber. Glenn approached on sandaled feet, his silk cloak hanging down to trail the red carpet of the floor. A short trimmed beard framed Glenn's tanned features, and his dark eyes held a glint of mischief, even after all these years. "My master," Hector's servant said, kneeling before his throne. Hector sighed, waving for the man to stand. "What is it, Glenn? And again, you don't have to kneel every time you come to see me." Glenn shook his bald head as he stood from the red carpet that led to Hector's throne. "I insist, sire. You are one of Akendar's block lords. As such, you are deserving of every ounce of respect I can give you." Hector sighed again and stood to his full height, towering above Glenn by a solid 2 feet. Glenn was by no means a small man. It was just that Hector was overly massive, a result of his unorthodox upbringing. "It is a small block and I am a humble man," Hector told Glenn, stepping down the carpeted stairs towards his servant. "Please just call me Hector." "That makes you sound all the more worthy of serving, my lord," Glenn said with a small smile. "I would sooner stick a knife in another lord's neck before referring to you by just your name." Hector laughed and shook his head. "Don't say that where others can hear you. You know how the serpents of this city slither in all corners." "Aye, my lord," Glenn said, bringing his voice down to a whisper. "I have news pertaining to the Starfall." Hector's golden eyes widened in surprise. "Is that so? I am eager to hear this news. Please speak it." Hector had been aching to learn more about the Starfall and the moon monster that had appeared next to Retna. He dearly hoped that his suspicions on what the mask could be were false. But until he gathered more intel, all he had to go on was a guess. God, let it just be a guess. "A man has risen from one of the fallen stars, my lord," Glenn said silently. Hector gasped. "A man? As in, a human?" Glenn nodded. "Aye, my lord, a human." Hector gave a sigh of relief. Just a human. Not what he had thought these stars might be. Though, if these Starfallen really were human, Hector would have a different kind of problem on his hands. "The Starfallen has a name, and has already earned himself quite the reputation," Glenn said, locking his fingers together. "He has destroyed an army of fiends, saving the Fiendwall and likely the Feywood from total annihilation. But even more impressively, if the report is accurate, then he has slain a Pillarborn as well." Hector's brow shot up in surprise. The presence of a Pillarborn meant that the end of the world was coming soon, right? He sighed and put a massive hand on Glenn's shoulder. "Thank you for your good work, Glenn. Now, you said the Starfallen had a name. I would hear it." "Of course, my lord," Glenn said with a nod. "He goes by Hoplite." Hector's blood immediately went cold, and he backed away from Glenn with a startled gasp. Impossible. It was impossible. Hector put a quivering hand to his face, his golden eyes seeming to shake in his skull. "His number!" Hector suddenly shouted. "What is his number, Glenn?" Glenn's eyes widened in shock, and he put his hands up in a calming gesture before saying, "I do not know what you mean, my lord. All I know is his name. Not this number. Was he a slave? Hector took a deep breath to steady his nerves before he clasped his hands behind his back, turning away from Glenn to stare at his throne. Glenn, please leave me for a time. Please find out his number if possible. I need to know, Hector rasped, tears threatening to slide down his cheeks. Aye, my lord. Be well, Glenn said slowly. When next we speak, I hope to have the information you are asking for. Hector said nothing as Glenn left his presence, and as soon as those doors closed, his shoulders slumped. We were slaves, Glenn, Hector whispered. We all were. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you're new here, welcome aboard. Check out the description for the story and join the Discord if you like. Consider supporting the channel and the author as well. It's a dangerous world out there, but remember to be brave and look up to seek the stars.